A limestone slab, broken in two, sits behind glass in the British Museum. It was carried down a mountain in 1869 by a British Army officer who had no idea what he was holding. The inscription on it names an oath. The mountain it came from has a name that means, in ancient Hebrew, banned or set apart for destruction. And according to a text that was once read as scripture and then quietly erased from the Bible, that exact mountain is where 200 beings swore themselves to a fate their descendants are still living out. This is the story of Mount Hermon, the Book of Enoch, and the strange, well-documented reasons the two have never stopped being connected. Mount Hermon rises on the border where modern Syria, Lebanon, and the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights meet. Its summit reaches roughly 2,114 meters, making it the highest point in the region, visible from the Sea of Galilee, from Damascus, from the hills above Jerusalem on a clear day. For thousands of years before any of the borders that now cross it existed, it was already a sacred boundary marker. The Hebrew Bible mentions it repeatedly as the northern edge of Israelite territory, the place where conquest stopped and the unknown began. The name itself is old, and its meaning is not gentle. It comes from the Semitic root, HRM, the same root behind the Hebrew word sherem, which shows up throughout the Torah to describe something devoted to destruction, something so dangerous it has to be permanently removed from ordinary use. It is not a soft word. When Joshua's armies place a conquered city under cherem, it means annihilation. When the term is applied to a mountain, it is not a poetic flourish. It is closer to a warning sign. That name and that warning is what the Book of Enoch attaches its central story to. The Book of Enoch is not part of the Hebrew Bible, and it is not part of the Protestant, Catholic, or most Orthodox biblical canons. It survives today primarily because one church refused to let it go. But for centuries before that refusal became necessary, Enoch circulated widely. Fragments of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, first uncovered in 1947 and excavated through the following decade. 11 separate Aramaic and Hebrew copies of Enoch turned up in the Qumran caves, a number that puts it among the more frequently copied texts found there, ahead of several books that did eventually make it into the Hebrew Bible. Whoever lived at Qumran in the last centuries before the Common Era treated Enoch as important enough to copy again and again. The text claims to be the account of a man named Enoch, described in the book of Genesis in a single strange sentence as someone who walked with God and was then simply taken without dying. That gap in the biblical record, one man who never experienced death and who vanished into direct contact with the divine, became fertile ground for an entire body of literature attributed to him, written across several centuries by different authors and later compiled into what scholars now call one Enoch. The oldest sections, including the story that concerns Mount Hermon, are generally dated by scholars to the 3rd century BCE, making them older than most of the material that would eventually be canonized as the Hebrew Bible's final form. The relevant story sits in chapters 6 through 11 in a section scholars call the Book of the Watchers. It describes a group of 200 angelic beings called Watchers who look down at human women and decide to take them as wives. This alone would be a serious transgression in the text's cosmology. Angels are not supposed to cross that boundary. But the text adds a second layer. Before descending, the 200 bind themselves together with a mutual oath, agreeing that they will all go through with the act together so that no one can back out and leave the others exposed. And the text is explicit about where this oath is sworn. Chapter 6 states plainly that it happened on the summit of Mount Hermon, in the days of a figure named Jared, and that the mountain took its name specifically because of that oath. This is where the etymology becomes interesting rather than incidental. The text is not simply setting its story on a conveniently ominous mountain. It is offering an origin story for the name itself, tying the root meaning of ban, or set apart, directly to the moment 200 angels swore themselves to a transgression at that exact summit. Whether the name predates the story, or the story was built to explain an existing name, is a question scholars still debate, but the fact that ancient readers understood Hermon's name as tied to an oath is not in dispute. The 19th century French scholar Charles Simon Clermont Ganneau referred to the mountain as the Mountain of Oath in his own writing on the region's toponymy, independent of any theological argument he was trying to make. What happens after the descent, according to the text, is judgment. In chapters 9 and 10, the Watchers' actions produce catastrophic consequences. Their unions with human women are said to have produced a race of giant offspring called the Nephilim, and the resulting violence and corruption on earth prompts an appeal to God for intervention. God responds by ordering the Watchers bound. The language used is specific and physical, not abstract. One angel, named in the text as Azazel, is to be bound hand and foot and thrown into darkness in a desert location called Dudael, covered with sharp rocks, his face covered so that he cannot see light, left there until a final judgment. The leader of the 200, named Semyaza, along with the rest of his group, is bound as well and confined in the text's words for 70 generations, until the day of their judgment. Different manuscript traditions render this material with different degrees of vividness. Robert Henry Charles produced the Standard English translation in 1906, and it remains the version most widely read in the West, but Charles was working within the sensibilities of Edwardian biblical scholarship, and in places his translation softens language that reads more starkly in the underlying Ge'ez and Aramaic. Later translators, including Michael Knibb in his 1978 two-volume Oxford edition and Ephraim Isaac in the 1983 Charlesworth Pseudepigrapha volume, worked more directly from the oldest available witnesses, and in several passages preserve a harsher, more physically explicit binding sequence than Charles allowed into his edition. This is not a case of forged content being added. It is a case of different translators making different choices about how literally to render language that all three source traditions, Ge'ez, Greek, and Aramaic, agree on in substance. The 70 generations detail deserves its own explanation, because it has produced more speculation than almost any other line in the text. A generation in ancient Near Eastern reckoning is typically counted somewhere between 35 and 40 years. 70 generations at that rate works out to somewhere between roughly 2,150 and 2,800 years. Traditional biblical chronologies, working backward from later genealogies, tend to place the flood narrative, which follows immediately after the binding of the Watchers in Enoch's sequence, somewhere in the range of the 25th to 28th century BCE. Add 70 generations forward from that window, and the resulting date lands somewhere in the 20th or 21st century of the Common Era. This arithmetic has become, in recent years, a popular hook for online content claiming that we are living inside the final countdown the text describes. It is worth being precise about what can and cannot be said here. The math itself is simple and correct. If you accept a generation length of 35 to 40 years in a traditional flood chronology, the ark does land somewhere near the present. But every input to that calculation is contested. Generation length varies across ancient sources. Flood chronologies vary by hundreds of years depending on which genealogical tradition you follow. And the number 70 itself, in ancient Near Eastern and biblical literature more broadly, frequently functions as a symbolic figure representing completeness rather than a literal count. The 70 years of Babylonian exile in Jeremiah being the most direct biblical parallel. Some scholars, including George Nicholsburg in his influential Fortress Press commentary on For Your Word Enoch, note that other numbers in the same chapters of Enoch, 400 years, 500 years, are treated with what looks like intended precision, which complicates a purely symbolic reading of 70 as well. The honest position is that the text's timeline is genuinely ambiguous, and any claim that it points precisely at the present decade is an interpretation layered on top of the evidence, not a conclusion the evidence forces. What is not ambiguous is the physical history of how this text was suppressed, preserved, and rediscovered. And that history is, on its own, remarkable enough to carry a documentary without any speculative arithmetic attached to it. The Book of Enoch was excluded from the Hebrew canon that crystallized after the destruction of the Second Temple, and it never entered the New Testament canon either, despite being directly quoted in the Epistle of Jude, one of the few places in the New Testament where a non-canonical text is cited by name. Early Christian writers in the first 2 centuries CE, including Justin Martyr and Tertullian, treated Enoch's account of the Watchers as broadly credible, part of the explanatory background for how evil entered the world. That acceptance did not survive the 4th century. As Christian theology consolidated under the emerging authority of church councils, Enoch's material on angels who could take physical form, marry, and produce offspring sat increasingly uncomfortably against developing doctrines about the nature of angelic beings. The Synod of Laodicea, held around 363 to 364 CE, produced one of the earliest formal canonical lists that excludes Enoch outright, part of a broader wave of canon-fixing councils in that period. Augustine, writing in the City of God in the early 5th century, went further than simple exclusion, arguing that the text's specificity, its willingness to name places, durations, and individuals, counted against its authenticity rather than for it, on the reasoning that authentic scripture would not traffic in such precise claims. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around the same period, categorized it firmly as apocryphal. In the Western Church, that was effectively the end of Enoch's circulation for over 1,000 years. It survived, but only as a name mentioned in other texts, a book people knew had existed without any way to read it. One church never went along with the exclusion. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, operating outside the authority of Rome and Constantinople, retained Upper-Start Enoch as canonical scripture, and its monasteries preserved complete Ge'ez translations for well over a millennium, while the rest of Christendom treated the book as lost. This single fact is why the text exists today in complete form at all. Without the Ethiopian Church's continuous transmission, modern readers would have only the fragmentary quotations preserved in other ancient authors to work from. The West rediscovered Enoch through one of the more colorful episodes in the history of manuscript recovery. James Bruce, a Scottish traveler and diplomat, journeyed through Abyssinia in the 1770s in search of the source of the Blue Nile, and while there, he acquired 3 complete Ge'ez manuscripts of Enoch. He brought them back to Europe in 1773. One was presented to the Royal Library in Paris, and is now held in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. The other 2 eventually reached the Bodleian Library at Oxford, where they remain catalogued as Bruce 74 and Oriental 531. A 4th Bruce-era manuscript, held at the Vatican and catalogued as Vatican Ethiopic 71, was confirmed by researcher Gabriele Boccaccini's work in 2018 as part of the same acquisition. The first English translation, by Richard Lawrence, appeared in 1821, working directly from Bruce's manuscripts. It would be another 85 years before Robert Henry Charles produced the more rigorous scholarly translation that became the standard reference edition in 1906. The Ge'ez manuscripts alone would have been enough to confirm that Enoch was an ancient text with a real transmission history. What happened at Qumran went further, and it happened almost by accident. In 1947, Bedouin shepherds discovered the first cache of scrolls in a cave near the ruins of Qumran on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. Over the following decade, archaeologists and local searchers located 10 more caves, producing what became known collectively as the Dead Sea Scrolls, a body of manuscripts dating from roughly the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE. Among the fragments recovered from Cave 4 were 11 separate Aramaic copies of sections of Enoch, catalogued today under references including 4Q201 and 4Q204. These fragments predate the Ge'ez manuscripts James Bruce carried out of Ethiopia by well over 1,000 years, and they confirmed, in the original language, that the Watcher's narrative was not a later Ethiopian elaboration. It was present, in something close to its familiar form, in Jewish religious literature centuries before the birth of Christianity. The scholar most closely associated with this material is Joseph Milik, a Polish specialist in Semitic languages who held responsibility for the Qumran Enochic fragments for decades. His 1976 Oxford volume, The Books of Enoch, Aramaic Fragments of Qumran Cave 4, remains the foundational critical edition of the material and the starting point for essentially all subsequent scholarship on the Aramaic Enoch tradition. Milik also worked on a related set of Aramaic fragments known as the Book of Giants, catalogued as 4Q530 through 4Q532, among others, a text that expands on the offspring of the Watchers, described briefly in Enoch. Milik continued working on this material until his death in 2006, and a fully definitive critical edition of the Book of Giants fragments was still not complete at the time. The reasons for that are mundane rather than mysterious. The fragments are genuinely difficult, physically damaged, incomplete, and written in a dialect of Aramaic that requires painstaking reconstruction, the kind of work that routinely outlives individual scholars in this field. But the fact remains that more than 70 years after their discovery, parts of this specific textual tradition are still being assembled. The modern academic authority on how all of this fits together is George Nicholsburg, whose 2001 Fortress Commentary on Warren Enoch is the standard reference work used in universities and seminaries today. Nicholsburg treats the Watcher's narrative as a coherent piece of Second Temple period theology, one that used the story of transgressing angels to address real anxieties in its own time about violence, corrupted knowledge, and the origins of evil, likely written against the backdrop of the political upheaval following Alexander the Great's conquests and the wars between his successors. He is not a fringe figure making speculative claims. His work is measured, cautious, and grounded in textual comparison across the Ge'ez, Greek, and Aramaic witnesses. It is Nicholsburg who provides the direct scholarly link to the physical artifact this story keeps circling back to. In 1869, a British Army officer and surveyor named Charles Warren, later famous for his work investigating the Whitechapel murders as Metropolitan Police Commissioner, was conducting survey work in the region for the Palestine Exploration Fund. He climbed to the northern summit of Mount Hermon and located the ruins of a temple, later identified and named Qasr Antar, sitting at one of the highest elevations of any known structure from the ancient world, close to the mountain's peak. Warren described a rectangular structure of hewn stone blocks on an oval stone plateau, with no roof and no clear evidence it had ever had one. On the northwest corner of that plateau, he found and removed a limestone stele, breaking it into 2 pieces to transport it down the mountain, and carried it back to the British Museum, where it remains today. The stele sat uncatalogued for 15 years before receiving formal attention, and a full English translation was not published until 1903, 34 years after Warren removed it. The Greek inscription, in the translation later refined by Nicholsburg himself, reads roughly as follows: "According to the command of the greatest and holy God, those who take an oath proceed from here." Nicholsburg connects this inscription directly to the oath scene in Enoch chapter 6, noting that the phrase, "the greatest and holy God," closely parallels a divine title used repeatedly throughout the Enoch corpus. This does not prove that the temple was built to commemorate the specific events described in Enoch. The structure itself is generally dated to the Greco-Roman period, centuries after Enoch's Watcher story was first composed, which means the temple almost certainly reflects a later cultic tradition that had grown up around the mountain's reputation rather than a physical monument from the events Enoch describes. But it does demonstrate something scholars find genuinely significant, that by the time this temple was built, the association between Mount Hermon and oath-taking before the greatest god was well enough established in regional religious memory to be carved into stone at the summit itself. The geography surrounding the mountain adds another layer that ancient audiences would have recognized immediately. At the base of Hermon lies the Banias Grotto, a limestone karst cave that the first-century Jewish historian Josephus Flavius described as extraordinarily deep and full of water. Later, Greco-Roman tradition associated the cave with entrances to the underworld, and it became a site under the name Panias, associated with the god Pan and with ritual offerings thrown into the water. This is not part of the Enoch text itself, but it reflects the same regional instinct that the area around Hermon was understood across multiple cultures and centuries as a boundary zone between the human world and something beneath or beyond it. The mountain's modern status only adds to the sense that this is unfinished business. Following the 1967 war, Israel took control of the southern slopes of Mount Hermon. After the 1973 war, the United Nations Disengagement Observer Force was established under a 1974 agreement, and the summit area has remained within a UN-monitored zone of separation ever since, with a permanently staffed observation post near the peak that UN documentation has described as the highest permanently manned position under UN command anywhere in the world. The area has been an active military zone, on and off, for most of the last 6 decades, and Qasr Antar itself, the temple Warren surveyed in 1869, has never been subjected to a comprehensive modern excavation or geophysical survey. A 2025 archaeological review of the region's Roman-era religious sites notes plainly that access to the summit and upper slopes remains constrained by the overlapping national borders and ongoing military presence, which complicates both fieldwork and the sharing of data between researchers working on either side of the boundary. It is tempting, and this is where a lot of popular content on this subject goes further than the evidence supports, to read that access restriction as confirmation that something is being deliberately hidden. The more mundane and far more likely explanation is that this is simply one of the most heavily contested and militarized borders on Earth, and archaeological access to active military zones is restricted for the same reason. It is restricted anywhere else in the world. Safety and sovereignty, not concealment of ancient secrets. Warren's stele is not hidden. It sits on public display in London and has been examined, translated, and cross-referenced by generations of scholars. The Ge'ez manuscripts are not hidden. They are cataloged and accessible in 3 of the most prestigious research libraries in Europe. The Qumran fragments are not hidden. They are published, photographed, and available for study, even if some individual pieces remain difficult to fully reconstruct because of physical damage, rather than restricted access. What is genuinely true and does not require any exaggeration to be striking is this. An apocalyptic Jewish text written more than 2,000 years ago named a specific mountain as the site of a foundational transgression, offered an etymology for that mountain's name tied to an oath, and described a binding sentence measured in generations. Centuries later, without any surviving evidence that the builders were working from the Enoch tradition specifically, people constructed the highest temple of the ancient world on that exact summit and carved an oath formula into stone there. The book that told this story was formally excluded from Christian scripture in the 4th century, on the explicit grounds that its precision and specificity made it suspect rather than credible, an argument that inverts how most people intuitively judge the reliability of a source. It survived for over 1,000 years only because one church, outside the reach of the councils that excluded it, kept copying it. It was rediscovered by a Scottish adventurer looking for the source of a river, confirmed in its oldest form by fragments pulled out of desert caves by shepherds looking for a lost goat, and is still, to this day, being reconstructed by scholars working from damaged pieces that outlived the man who spent his career on them. None of that requires a countdown clock or a chamber of the chained angels to be worth taking seriously. The convergence of a name, a story, a mountain, a temple, and an inscription is either an extraordinary coincidence of ancient religious geography, or it is evidence that a story people told themselves about that mountain was consistent enough across languages, cultures, and centuries that it kept getting written into the landscape itself. Either way, the mountain is still there. The stele is still in London. The manuscripts are still in Oxford, Paris, and the highlands of Ethiopia. And the fragments Milik spent his life on are still, decades later, not entirely finished being read.